The security uniform hung on the back of the bathroom door, navy blue polyester that smelled faintly of hospital disinfectant and cafeteria coffee. Nathaniel Brennan. Nate, to the handful of people who still called him by name, stood barefoot on the cold linoleum of his efficiency apartment, staring at the fabric like it might offer answers to questions he'd stopped asking years ago. 9 p.m. The digital clock on the microwave blinked its accusation in red. Time to go. In the living room that doubled as Emma's bedroom, his daughter sat cross-legged on the pull-out couch, pencil gripped tight in her left hand, workbook spread across her knees. Third-grade math. Fractions. She chewed her bottom lip the way her mother used to when concentrating a small inheritance that could still knock the wind out of Nate's chest if he looked too long. Emma glanced up, caught him watching. Her eyes hazel like his. Not the deep brown Sarah had passed to neither of them, scanned his face with the kind of careful attention 8-year-olds shouldn't need to master. "Dad, when will we have a backyard?" The question landed soft, but carried weight. Nate crossed the worn carpet, sat on the arm of the second-hand recliner, close enough to ruffle her dark hair. "Soon, sweetheart, I promise." The lie tasted familiar. Emma didn't call him on it. She just nodded, returned to her fractions, and Nate rose to finish dressing for another shift at St. Mercy Hospital, where promises went to die under fluorescent lights and the steady beep of machines that couldn't save everyone. His hands moved through the routine without thought. Button the shirt, tuck it in, clip the badge to his belt. The ID photo showed a version of himself from 3 years ago, thinner in the face, eyes not quite so hollow. Security officer, night shift. The title sounded more official than the reality, walking empty corridors, checking locked doors, helping nurses move patients too heavy for one person to manage alone. Invisible work. The kind that let him clock out at 6 a.m. and drive Emma to school before the morning bell, make her breakfast, check her homework, be present in all the ways he hadn't been when it mattered most. The bedroom, his bedroom before Emma took it, and he claimed the couch held a dresser with a stuck-bottom drawer. Nate didn't open it often. Tonight he did. Inside, nestled in an old T-shirt that still smelled like deployment and dust, lay the silver cross. The metal caught the dim light from the hallway, purple ribbon faded, but the silver still bright. Next to it, a photograph, 5 men in desert fatigues, rifles, slung grins splitting their faces under a punishing sun. 3 of those men never made it home. The 4th lost both legs and most of his mind to an IED outside a village whose name Nate could still pronounce perfectly in his sleep. He touched the frame, let his thumb rest on the face of Corporal Danny Reeves, 22 years old forever, and closed the drawer. Sarah had been driving Emma to daycare when the drunk driver crossed the median. Nate had been 7,000 miles away running triage in a field hospital, saving strangers, while his wife bled out on Highway 40 and his 3-year-old daughter screamed in a car seat he'd installed too loosely because he'd been in a hurry to catch his flight back to base. The Red Cross notification came through on a satellite phone. He'd been holding another man's intestines in place, talking him through the pain-promising sunrise. By the time Nate made it stateside, Sarah was already in the ground and Emma was living with his sister in Ohio, drawing pictures of a mom she'd soon start forgetting. He left the Army 4 months later. Honorable discharge, family hardship. They didn't argue. He took the first job that offered night hours and asked no questions. Security guard at the same hospital where they'd pronounced Sarah dead on arrival 5 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on him. Neither was the penance. Emma appeared in the doorway, bare feet, silent on the carpet, clutching the battered stuffed rabbit she'd had since infancy. "You're thinking about Mom again?" Not a question. Nate managed a smile that probably didn't reach his eyes. "Just making sure I have everything for work." She patted over small arms wrapping around his waist. He bent down, gathered her up, even though she was getting too big for it, buried his face in her hair that smelled like the strawberry shampoo she insisted on using because it came in a bottle shaped like a cartoon character. "I love you, Dad." The words were a lifeline. He held tighter. "Love you too, sweetheart. More than anything." She pulled back, studied him with that too-old gaze. "You're a good person, even when you're sad." Something cracked in his chest. He set her down, gently kissed the top of her head. "Get your backpack ready for tomorrow. I'll drop you at Aunt Linda's on my way." Linda lived 2 blocks over, worked from home, didn't mind keeping Emma overnight when Nate pulled doubles. She never asked for money he didn't have. Family took care of family. It was the one thing the Brennans still did right. 20 minutes later, Nate's pickup truck, a '98 Ford with 200,000 miles and a suspicious rattle in the engine, pulled into the staff lot behind St. Mercy. The hospital rose 7 stories against the night sky, windows glowing yellow and white, a beacon for the broken. He killed the engine, sat in the silence, and watched other night shift workers trudge toward the employee entrance, nurses, custodians, lab techs, the invisible army that kept the machine running while the rest of the city slept. His phone buzzed. Text from Linda: "Emma's asleep. Don't worry. Focus on work." He pocketed the phone and headed inside. The security office occupied a windowless room near the loading docks, barely large enough for 3 desks, a wall of monitors showing camera feeds, and a bulletin board covered in outdated memos. Gary, the day shift supervisor, looked up from his crossword puzzle, nodded. "Quiet night so far. Jenkins called in sick, so you're covering the main building solo." Nate clocked in, grabbed his radio, checked the battery. "Anything I should know?" "Room 412 has a patient who keeps trying to leave AMA. Psych eval pending. Otherwise standard." Standard meant he'd walk 8 miles of hallways, check supply closets, make sure the ER entrance stayed locked after midnight, and try not to think about the fact that this was his life. Now, 38 years old, living paycheck to paycheck, raising a daughter in an apartment with no backyard, while his combat medic training gathered dust in a drawer next to a medal he'd earned saving men who died anyway. He started his rounds on the 7th floor. Pediatrics. The hallway smelled like antiseptic and the faint sweetness of juice boxes. Most of the rooms were dark, children sleeping under thin blankets, parents curled in chairs beside them. Nate moved quietly, boots barely whispering on the linoleum, checking doors, nodding to the night nurse at the station. She looked up, offered a tired smile. "Hey, Nate, could you help me move Mr. Patterson in 710? He's a big guy, needs repositioning." Nate followed her into the room. "Mr." Patterson was indeed large, maybe 300 pounds, intubated, unconscious. Together they shifted him to prevent bed sores, adjusted the tubes and wires, made sure everything stayed connected. The nurse thanked him. Nate waved it off, moved on. 5th floor, oncology. Quieter here, heavier. The kind of silence that pressed down on your shoulders. He checked the stairwells, tested the fire doors, kept moving. 3rd floor, general medicine. An elderly woman in a wheelchair sat alone near the elevators, clutching a purse, looking lost. Nate crouched beside her. "Ma'am, can I help you find your room?" She blinked, confused, then focused on his face. "I'm supposed to meet my son. He's late." Nate glanced at the clock. 2:15 a.m. "Let's get you back to bed. I'm sure he'll come visit during regular hours." He wheeled her back to her room, helped her settle in, made sure the call button was within reach. She patted his hand. "You're very kind." He wasn't kind. He was just doing what needed doing. There was a difference. 1st floor, emergency room, the nerve center. Nate took up position near the ambulance bay entrance, watching the parking lot through reinforced glass. This was where Sarah had been brought. This was where they'd tried and failed. He didn't let himself think about it. The radio crackled. "Incoming trauma, car crash near downtown bridge, ETA 2 minutes. Nate's training kicked in, muscle memory from years of hearing those words in a different language under a different sky. He moved to the automatic doors, eyes on the street. Distant sirens grew louder. Red and blue lights painted the darkness. The ambulance screamed into the bay. Doors flew open. Paramedics jumped out, yanked the gurney, and Nate saw her before his brain could process the details. Mid-30s, designer clothes, shredded and bloody face, pale as death. Dark hair matted with something wet and red. She wasn't moving. One paramedic shouted toward the ER doors. "What happened?" "Car crash. Single vehicle. Lost control on the bridge. Major impact. Possible internal bleeding. BP dropping fast." The gurney rolled past Nate. He caught a glimpse of her face, sharp features, expensive makeup, smeared eyes closed. Then the ER team swarmed and she disappeared through the doors. Nate stayed at his post. Not his job. Not his problem. Except the ER doors burst open again, and a nurse he recognized, Jenny Young, competent, ran toward him, eyes wide. "Dr. Martinez is stuck in traffic. She's crashing." Nate's feet moved before his brain gave permission. He followed Jenny inside. The trauma bay exploded with controlled chaos. Monitors beeping, nurses cutting away clothing, blood pooling on the floor. The woman on the table still unconscious, chest barely rising. Jenny looked at him desperate. "You used to be a medic, right?" Nate had never told anyone. But hospital gossip traveled. Someone in HR must have looked at his file. "Yeah. We need you. Now." The attending nurse, older experience, shot him a look that said, "You're just security," but didn't have time to argue. Nate stepped to the bedside. 5 years fell away. This was Afghanistan. This was a field hospital. This was what his hands knew how to do. He checked her airway patent. Breathing shallow, thready. Circulation weak, pulse rapid. Bleeding from a laceration on her left arm, another on her scalp. He grabbed gauze from the crash cart, applied pressure. The woman's eyes flickered open. Unfocused. Terrified. Her voice came out as a whisper, barely audible over the machines. "Wait. Please. Just make it fast. I don't want the pain." The words punched through Nate's chest. He'd heard them before. Different voice. Different place. A kid from Texas, gut shot, 20 years old, begging for morphine they didn't have, begging for it to end because the pain was everything and nothing else existed. Nate's hands didn't stop working, but his voice dropped into the register he'd used 100 times in the field, calm, firm, the kind of voice that cuts through panic and pulls people back from the edge. "Not tonight, ma'am. You're going to see tomorrow's sunrise." Her eyes found his face, struggling to focus, struggling to understand. Nate peeled off his security jacket without thinking, draped it over her torso. The hospital gown they'd cut away left her exposed, shivering. The jacket was thin, mostly symbolic, but her shaking eased slightly. "You're safe. I've got you. Just focus on my voice." The overhead light caught his left wrist as he reached for fresh gauze. The tattoo he'd gotten after his second deployment stood out stark against his skin. 68W Medic, the Army Occupational Specialty Code, flanked by a rod of Asclepius. He saw her eyes track to it, saw something flicker in her expression. Recognition, confusion, maybe hope. Then her hand moved, trembling, reaching out. Nate caught it, held it tight. "Stay with me. What's your name?" Her lips barely formed the syllable. Belle." "Okay, Belle. I'm Nate. You were in an accident. The doctor's on his way. You're going to be fine. Keep breathing with me. In and out." He counted her breaths, monitored her pulse, kept pressure on the bleeding, talked her through every second because that's what you did. You kept them conscious, kept them fighting, didn't let them slip away into the dark. Dr. Martinez burst through the doors 7 minutes later, scrubs hastily thrown on, eyes sharp. He took in the scene, Nate at the bedside, vitals stabilized, bleeding controlled, and something like surprise crossed his face. "You did this." Nate stepped back, hands up, already fading toward the wall. "Just kept her steady, Doc. She's all yours." Martinez moved in, started barking orders. The nurses responded. The machine took over. Nate retreated into the hallway, pulse hammering, hands trembling now that the adrenaline had somewhere to go. Jenny found him leaning against the wall, staring at nothing. "You saved her life." Nate shook his head. "Doc saved her. I just bought time." "That's the same thing." It wasn't. Saving someone meant they lived. Buying time just meant they died slower. He'd learned the difference in a desert half a world away. Through the trauma bay windows, Nate watched them prep Belle for surgery. She turned her head, scanning the room, and for a moment her eyes found his through the glass. Her lips moved. He couldn't hear the words, but he could read them. "Thank you." He nodded once. Then he turned and walked away back into the fluorescent anonymity of the hospital corridors, just another night shift worker in a building full of people nobody noticed. The cafeteria was nearly empty at 3 a.m. Nate bought coffee from the vending machine, sat at a corner table, and tried to stop his hands from shaking. He'd been out of the game 5 years. The muscle memory was still there, but the cost of using it the way it dragged him back into memories he'd buried that was higher than he'd expected. Emma was waiting when he got home at 6:30. Linda had dropped her off early, probably sensing Nate needed to see his daughter, needed something real and uncomplicated to anchor him. She sat at the kitchen table, coloring book open, crayons scattered. "Dad, look what I drew." The picture showed a figure in a cape chest emblazoned with a crooked star. Nate leaned over her shoulder, forced his exhausted brain to focus. "That's amazing, sweetheart." Emma beamed. "It's you. You're a superhero." Something twisted in his chest. He kissed the top of her head. "I'm just your dad. That's better than a superhero." She considered this seriously. "Maybe, but you still help people." He didn't know how to answer that. So he made her breakfast instead, scrambled eggs, toast, orange juice, and they ate together while morning light crawled through the kitchen window and erased the night. He never mentioned what happened. Heroes didn't need headlines, and Nate had stopped being a hero the day he couldn't save his wife. Belle Lockhart, though Nate wouldn't learn her full name until later, woke in a private room on the hospital's top floor 17 hours after surgery. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, white walls, expensive flowers on the nightstand, the kind of room reserved for people who could afford to nearly die in comfort. Her arm throbbed under fresh bandages. Ribs screamed when she tried to sit up. Head pounded with the rhythm of her pulse. But she was alive. Against all odds and her own whispered request, she was alive. Memory came in fragments. Rain, headlights, the sickening crunch of metal. Then voices, hands, a man's face swimming into focus above her. "You're going to see tomorrow's sunrise." She remembered the jacket draped over her, remembered the tattoo on his wrist, numbers and letters that meant something, though her pain-fogged brain couldn't decode them. Remembered his hand holding hers steady and warm, an anchor in the chaos. The door opened. A nurse, young, blonde, kind eyes, entered with a chart. "Miss Lockhart, good to see you awake. How's your pain level?" Belle's throat felt raw. "Manageable." "What happened?" The nurse checked vitals, adjusted the IV. "You were in a car accident. Single vehicle. You're very lucky. The security guard who helped stabilize you before Dr. Martinez arrived, he really knew what he was doing." Belle's mind stalled. "Security guard?" "Yeah, Nate. He works night shift. Used to be a medic or something. Kept you alive until the doctor got here." The words didn't compute. A security guard, not a surgeon, not even a nurse. Someone whose job description involved checking doors and walking hallways had pulled her back from the edge. The door opened again. Grant Ellis, her assistant, impeccably dressed even at 7 a.m., rushed in, tablet in hand, face pale with worry. "Miss Lockhart, thank God. The media, they know about the accident. The board is asking questions." Belle closed her eyes. Of course they were. Weakness was blood in the water. The sharks would circle. "What are they saying?" Grant hesitated. "Just that you were in a single-car crash. They want to know if anyone else was involved. And some reporters are asking who saved you. I heard it was a security guard. Should we—" "No." The word came out sharper than intended. Grant blinked. "No names. Tell the press the medical team handled everything professionally. Clean, simple. I don't need unnecessary attention." Grant nodded, already typing notes. "Of course. I'll draft a statement." He left. Belle lay back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling. A security guard had saved her life. A man whose name she didn't know, whose face she could barely remember through the haze of pain and fear. And her first instinct was to bury him in silence, because acknowledging him meant acknowledging vulnerability. She'd built Lockhart Industries from the ashes of her father's failing company, clawed her way to CEO by 28, earned a reputation as brilliant and ruthless in equal measure. She didn't owe anyone anything, especially not some night shift nobody who'd done his job. Except he hadn't just done his job. He'd looked into her eyes when she'd begged for it to end, and he'd promised her sunrise. And he'd been right. The guilt sat heavy in her chest, sharper than the broken ribs. Nate returned to St. Mercy for his next shift 36 hours later, after sleeping 14 hours straight and taking Emma to her soccer game. He didn't expect anything to change. That's not how these things worked. You did what needed doing, then you moved on. He was walking past the VIP wing on his rounds when a young nurse, not Jenny, someone he didn't recognize, stopped him. "Hey, are you Nate?" He paused. "Yeah," she smiled. "Miss Lockhart was asking about you this morning. The woman from the car crash. She's in 704. You should stop by. I'm sure she'd want to thank you." Nate's instinct was to decline. He'd done enough. But the nurse was already walking away and his feet carried him down the hall before his brain caught up. Room 704, door half open. He knocked softly, peered inside. Belle sat in a chair by the window, bathed in afternoon light. She looked smaller than she had on the gurney, fragile in a way that felt wrong for someone who'd survived a high-speed collision. Her eyes found him, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then she stood wincing, leaning on the chair arm for support. "You're Nate, right?" He stepped inside, hands in his pockets. "Yes, ma'am." Her gaze swept over him, taking in the uniform, the name badge, the unremarkable ordinariness of him, trying to reconcile the man in front of her with the hands that had held her together. "I wanted to thank you for the other night." Nate nodded. "Just doing my job, ma'am." The words hung between them. He turned to leave. But then another voice cut through the moment, Grant appearing from the private bathroom, phone in hand, expression tight. "Miss Lockhart, the PR team said it's better if we don't create a narrative around this. You know how media twists things." Belle's face shifted. Something closed off. The vulnerability Nate had glimpsed vanished behind a wall of polished composure. She looked at Nate, and when she spoke, her voice carried the kind of authority that came from boardrooms and hostile takeovers. "I appreciate what you did, but I'd prefer if you kept last night between us. I don't need rumors or attention. I'm sure you understand." Nate understood plenty. He understood that she'd begged for death and he'd denied her that mercy. He understood that he'd given her his jacket because she was cold and broken and human, and he understood that now, standing in her expensive room with her expensive assistant, she wanted him to disappear back into the shadows where people like him belonged. "Wasn't planning to talk about it." Belle's expression flickered. Maybe relief, maybe something else. "Good. I don't like owing people." Nate looked at her for a long moment. Let the silence stretch. Let her see that he knew exactly what she was doing and why. Then he spoke, voice quiet, but carrying the weight of every promise he'd made and kept and broken. "Then don't, ma'am. Just live better." He turned and walked out before she could respond. In the hallway, his hands were shaking again. Not from adrenaline this time. From anger. From the realization that some people would rather bury their saviors than admit they needed saving. He finished his shift, clocked out, drove home. Emma was already asleep on the couch, curled around her stuffed rabbit. He covered her with a blanket, kissed her forehead, and sat in the dark, listening to her breathe. The next evening, Emma burst through the apartment door before Nate had even finished unlocking it, backpack bouncing, face lit with excitement. "Dad, Dad, guess what?" He caught her, steadied her, smiled despite the exhaustion pulling at his bones. "What, sweetheart?" "Miss Lockhart's company donated a whole new computer lab to our school. We get tablets and everything. My teacher says it's because Miss Lockhart cares about education." The name hit Nate like a fist. Belle Lockhart, CEO, Billionaire. The woman he'd pulled back from the edge while she wore his jacket and gripped his hand. He walked Emma to the window, looked out at the street below. A black town car idled at the corner windows, tinted expensive and anonymous. As he watched it pulled away, disappearing into traffic, Emma tugged his sleeve. "Dad, Do you think she's a good person? Nate watched the empty space where the car had been, thought about the woman who'd whispered, "Just make it fast," and the woman who'd stood in her hospital room demanding silence. Thought about the donation that would give kids like Emma better futures, and the dismissal that had made him feel invisible all over again. People show gratitude in different ways, Em. Sometimes with words, sometimes with actions. Sometimes they just need time to figure out which one matters more. Emma wrapped her arms around his waist, squeezed tight. I think words and actions both matter. Nate looked down at his daughter, 8 years old, wise beyond measure, the only good thing he'd ever done right. You're smarter than most adults, you know that. She grinned up at him. I know. They made dinner together. Spaghetti, Emma's favorite. She talked about school, about her friends, about the new tablets they'd get to use. Nate listened and nodded and tried not to think about the woman in the hospital room who'd looked at him like he was both a savior and a problem to be managed. Later, after Emma was asleep, Nate stood at his own window staring out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Belle Lockhart was probably working late, rebuilding her empire, pretending she'd never been broken. And somewhere in the distance, dawn was already gathering, preparing to break over a world that didn't care who saved who or why. He touched the spot on his wrist where the tattoo lived, 68W-Medic, and wondered if some wounds were meant to stay open, if some debts were meant to go unpaid. Then he went to bed because in 6 hours he'd need to wake up and do it all again. Walk the halls, check the doors, stay invisible, save lives that wouldn't remember his name. It was enough. It had to be. The jacket, navy blue polyester St. Mercy security embroidered on the breast, hung on the back of his bathroom door, waiting for tomorrow night. 4 weeks bled into one another like watercolors left in rain. Nate walked his routes through St. Mercy's maze of corridors, checked locks that never failed, nodded to nurses who barely registered his presence. The hospital had swallowed the incident with Belle Lockhart. Whole, no announcements, no recognition, just the steady hum of an institution that treated miracles like paperwork. He preferred it that way. Anonymity was armor. Emma's school year marched forward. October brought parent-teacher conferences and a science project on ecosystems that required trips to the craft store Nate couldn't afford. He bought construction paper and glue sticks anyway. Watched his daughter build a miniature rainforest on their kitchen table, her tongue poking out in concentration. She talked less about wanting a backyard now. Maybe she'd learned not to ask for things that wouldn't come. The bullying started on a Tuesday. Emma came home with red eyes and a rip in her backpack strap. Nate was frying eggs for their breakfast dinner, still wearing his uniform from the overnight shift. He heard the door slam harder than usual, turned to find his daughter standing in the narrow hallway, shoulders hunched, face crumpling. He killed the heat, moved to her in 3 strides. What happened? She wouldn't meet his eyes. Her voice came out small and broken. Tyler said you're not a real hero. He said you're just a security guard, and that's like being a janitor. And when I told him you saved people, he laughed and said if you were so great you wouldn't live in a tiny apartment. The words landed like punches. Not because they were untrue, Nate had made peace with what he'd become, but because they'd reached Emma, had burrowed under her skin and planted seeds of shame about the only parent she had left. He knelt down, eye-level hands on her shoulders. Tyler doesn't know what he's talking about, and people who need to make others feel small are usually pretty small themselves. But we do live in a tiny apartment, and you are just a security guard. The just cut deepest. Nate pulled her into a hug, felt her body shake with held-back sobs. I'm your dad first. Everything else is just what I do to make sure you're okay. And that's enough for me. Is it enough for you? She nodded against his chest, but the damage was done. Nate could feel it in the way she held herself tighter, like she was trying to take up less space in the world. That night at work, walking the empty 4th-floor hallway, Nate's radio crackled with routine check-ins. His mind stayed on Emma, on the backyard she wanted, on the life he couldn't give her, on the savings account that never grew because every extra dollar went to her asthma medication or school supplies or the shoes she'd outgrown again. He'd given up everything, the career, the purpose, the identity to be present for her, and it still wasn't enough to shield her from the casual cruelty of 8-year-olds parroting their parents' views on class and worth. The nightmares returned that week. Nate would fall asleep on the couch and wake 3 hours later drenched in sweat, the smell of cordite and blood still sharp in his nostrils. In the dreams, he was always running, sprinting through sand that grabbed at his boots while mortars screamed overhead. He'd reach the wounded, apply tourniquets with shaking hands, scream for medevac that never came, and then he'd be home standing in a sterile hospital hallway, watching through a window as doctors worked on Sarah's broken body. Too late, always too late. Emma found him one night at 2 a.m. sitting upright on the couch, staring at nothing. She padded over in her pajamas, climbed into his lap without asking. "You're home, Dad. You're safe." Her small hand on his chest, right over his racing heart, pulled him back. He wrapped his arms around her, pressed his face into her hair. "I know, sweetheart. Just a bad dream." She didn't argue, just stayed there until his breathing evened out, until the ghosts retreated to wherever they waited between episodes. "Do you dream about the war?" The question surprised him. He'd never told her details, just that he'd been a soldier before she was born. "Sometimes." "Did you save people there too?" "I tried." She was quiet for a long moment, fingers tracing idle patterns on his arm. "Tyler's wrong. You're the bravest person I know." Nate held her tighter, hoped she couldn't feel how badly he was breaking. Across the city, in a corner office that overlooked downtown from 30 floors up, Belle Lockhart sat behind a desk made of reclaimed oak and stared at a file folder she had no business possessing. The HR director at St. Mercy had been reluctant to share employee records. Belle had made a donation to the hospital's new wing, $200,000, enough to ease ethical concerns. The file arrived by courier the next morning. She'd opened it at midnight alone in her office while the cleaning crew worked through the building below, started reading, and couldn't stop. Nathaniel James Brennan, born March 14, 1988, Cleveland, Ohio. High school diploma, associate degree in paramedicine completed during military service. Enlisted 2010. Combat medic 6-8 WMOS. 3 deployments. Decorated. The citations read like fiction, dragging wounded soldiers through crossfire, performing field surgery under conditions that would make a civilian surgeon quit medicine, refusing evacuation until every casualty was accounted for. Silver Cross for Valor. Purple Heart. Army Commendation Medal. A newspaper clipping from 2017, yellowed and scanned into the digital file. Medic saves 23 soldiers during ambush, awarded Silver Cross. The article detailed an attack on a supply convoy. Brennan had run into enemy fire 6 separate times, hauling men twice his size to cover working triage while bullets chewed through the vehicle frames around him. 2 soldiers had died anyway. Brennan had carried their bodies out himself. The photo showed a younger version of the man who'd held her hand in the ER, harder edges, eyes that looked past the camera into some middle distance. The citation quoted his commanding officer, Specialist Brennan, embodies the medic's creed. He refused to leave until every soldier was accounted for, living or dead. His actions saved 23 lives at extreme risk to his own. Belle's hands trembled. She set down the paper, picked up the next document. Discharge Honorable 2019. Reason family hardship. Emergency contact. Emma Rose Brennan, daughter, age 8. The note in the file, handwritten by someone in HR, explained the rest. Wife deceased, single father, needed stateside work with flexible hours. Hired as night security 2020. Salary $32,000 annually. Performance reviews. Exceeds expectations. Helpful. Quiet. Keeps to himself. Belle closed the folder and sat in silence while the city's lights blurred into abstract patterns through her office windows. She'd told him to stay quiet, to disappear, to accept invisibility as the price of her comfort, and he'd looked at her with those steady eyes and told her to live better. The guilt was a physical weight. Belle pressed her palms to her desk, tried to breathe through it. She'd spent 15 years building walls around her emotions, around her vulnerabilities, around anything that might be weaponized by competitors or board members looking for weakness. Her father had died of a heart attack at his desk when she was 16, left her a company hemorrhaging money and a board of directors who wanted to sell for parts. She'd fought them, won, and learned that survival meant never showing your throat. But Nate Brennan had seen her at her most broken, had heard her beg for death, and had denied her that escape because he believed she deserved to see sunrise, and she'd repaid him with silence and dismissal. Belle pulled out her phone, typed a message to Grant. "Find out everything about Lockhart Foundation's upcoming events. I want to attend." The response came in seconds. Grant never slept. "You're scheduled to speak at the annual Gala next month. Healthcare Access Initiative. $5 million pledge." Belle stared at the screen. Healthcare, the same system that had saved her because a minimum wage security guard had training the hospital administrators didn't know existed. She set the phone down, picked up the file again, read through Brennan's commendations until she'd memorized every word. At 3 a.m. she made a decision that would either redeem her or destroy whatever reputation she had left. The Lockhart Foundation Gala occupied the grand ballroom of the Riverside Hotel crystal chandeliers. Marble floors, 500 guests in formal wear, pretending their charity mattered as much as their tax write-offs. Belle stood backstage wearing midnight blue silk that cost more than most people's monthly rent and felt the familiar weight of performance settling over her shoulders. Grant materialized at her elbow, tablet glowing. 5 minutes, Miss Lockhart. The senator's speech is running long, but they'll wrap soon." Belle nodded absently. She'd delivered speeches like this a dozen times. Thank the donors, highlight the foundation's work, make the audience feel good about their wealth. Tonight felt different. The words she'd prepared sat wrong in her throat. Through a gap in the curtain she scanned the ballroom. Politicians, CEOs, hospital administrators, and near the back wall, barely visible in his dark uniform, Nathaniel Brennan. Her breath caught. She hadn't expected him here. Security for the event, probably, assigned to watch the exits and blend into the background. He stood with his hands clasped, face-neutral eyes, tracking the room with the same careful attention she'd seen in the ER. Grant noticed her staring. "Something wrong?" Belle turned away from the curtain. "No, just reviewing my notes." She hadn't reviewed anything. The speech was in her head, polished and empty. But seeing Brennan standing there, invisible to everyone who mattered, crystallized something that had been building since she'd read his file. The foundation director introduced her. Applause rippled through the ballroom. Belle walked on stage, heels clicking on polished wood, smile fixed in place. The podium microphone picked up her first words. "Good evening. Thank you all for being here tonight." She delivered the opening exactly as planned, gratitude, statistics, the foundation's mission. Watched the audience nod along, sipping champagne, already thinking about the after-party. Then she reached the part about the $5 million pledge to expand emergency services at St. Mercy Hospital. "This donation matters personally to me. Last month I was in a car accident. I nearly died." The room shifted. Heads lifted. This wasn't in the script. The person who stabilized me before the trauma surgeon arrived wasn't a doctor, wasn't a nurse. He was a night shift security guard who happened to have training. Most people never see put to use. Grant, visible in her peripheral vision, had gone pale. Belle kept talking. "Tonight we celebrate healthcare access. We talk about funding and infrastructure and policy. But real healthcare happens in moments most of us never witness, when someone with the skill and the courage steps forward because it's the right thing to do, not because they'll be recognized for it." She paused, found Brennan in the crowd. He'd gone very still. "We need more of those people, more individuals who show up, who do the work, who save lives in the margins while the rest of us applaud from a distance." The applause started uncertain, grew stronger. Belle stepped back from the podium as the foundation director moved to close the segment. She'd said enough, more than enough. Backstage, Grant was waiting with barely controlled panic. "Miss Lockhart, what was that? You went completely off script." "I said what needed saying." "But you exposed yourself, admitted weakness." The board can schedule a meeting if they're concerned." She pushed past him, moved through the backstage corridor toward the main ballroom. needed air, needed distance from the performance she'd just fractured. The ballroom's side doors opened onto a service hallway. Belle slipped through, heels in hand, now just wanting 30 seconds of silence. The sounds of the gala music, laughter, clinking glasses faded behind thick walls. Then she heard the commotion. Voices raised in alarm. Someone shouting for help. Belle moved toward the sound, emerged into a secondary ballroom being used for coat check and overflow seating. A crowd had formed near the center. She pushed through. An elderly man lay on the floor, face blue-gray, not breathing. Senator Douglas, she recognized him from political fundraisers, 75 if he was a day. His wife knelt beside him, screaming his name. The crowd froze, useless, terrified. Then Nate Brennan was there, dropping to his knees beside the senator with the fluid economy of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. He tilted the man's head back, checked for pulse, found nothing. His voice cut through the panic, calm and absolute. "Someone call 911, now." A woman fumbled for her phone. Nate positioned his hands on the senator's chest and started compressions. 30 pumps, fast and hard, the kind that crack ribs if you're doing them right. He bent down, delivered 2 rescue breaths. Repeated. Belle watched from the edge of the circle, frozen. This was what she'd seen in the ER, the precision, the complete focus, the way Brennan seemed to shed everything except the task in front of him. No hesitation, no fear. Just competence refined by repetition until it became instinct. 15 seconds. 30. 45. The senator gasped, coughed, eyes fluttering open. Color flooded back into his face. Nate kept his hands in position, ready to continue if needed, but the man was breathing on his own now, chest rising and falling. Paramedics arrived 2 minutes later, fast response probably already nearby for the gala. They took over. Nate stood, stepped back, and the crowd's attention shifted to the professionals. He'd become invisible again, except Belle had seen. Had watched him move from background extra to the only person who mattered in the space of a heartbeat. Had witnessed the same quiet heroism he'd shown when she was the one dying on a gurney. The senator's wife clutched Nate's hand, tears streaming. "Thank you. Oh, God, thank you." Nate nodded gently, extracted himself. "He's going to be fine, ma'am. The paramedics have him." Then he turned and nearly walked into Belle. They stood 2 feet apart. The crowd had surged forward to watch the paramedics work, leaving them in a pocket of relative privacy. Nate's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. Belle's throat felt tight. "That was you saved him." "Just CPR. Anyone could have done it." "But they didn't. You did." He shrugged, already moving to leave. Belle's hand shot out, caught his arm. He stopped, looked down at her fingers on his sleeve, then up at her face. "I need to know." The words spilled out before she could stop them. "Why did you do it? Save me, I mean, when I asked you to make it fast." Nate's jaw worked. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then his voice came low, meant only for her. "Because people who want to die usually just want the pain to stop, and pain ends. Death doesn't." He pulled free, gently walked away. Belle stood in the empty hallway, heart hammering, watching him disappear around a corner. When she returned to the gala proper, Grant was fielding questions from reporters who'd heard about the senator's collapse. Belle ignored them, went straight to the coat check, called her driver. She needed to go home, needed to think. But first she made a call. "Grant, I need you to pull Nathaniel Brennan's employment file from St. Mercy. Everything." "We already have." "I know. Pull it again. I want to see it with fresh eyes." She ended the call before he could ask why. The file arrived at her penthouse at midnight. Belle poured scotch she didn't drink, spread the documents across her dining table, and read them chronologically this time. Watched Nate Brennan's life unfold in reverse, from security guard, earning poverty wages, back through his military service, through citations and commendations, all the way to enlistment at 22. The gaps told their own story. He'd left the Army at 31. Emma was 8 now, born during his service. Wife deceased. The death certificate was attached, dated 5 years ago. Sarah Brennan, age 29, died from injuries sustained in a motor vehicle accident. Belle did the math. Nate had been deployed when his wife was killed, had come home to bury her and raise their daughter alone, had given up the career he'd been decorated for because Emma needed a parent more than the Army needed another medic. She found the photo from the medal ceremony again. Brennan standing at attention, chest covered in ribbons, face carved from stone. The caption quoted his response when asked about his actions, "I just did my job. The real heroes didn't make it home." Belle set down her glass, picked up her phone, hesitated. Then she called the one person who could get her what she needed. "Grant, I need you to set up a private press conference, tomorrow morning if possible." His voice came back groggy but alert. "Miss Lockhart, it's 1 a.m. Tomorrow morning. My office. Small pool of journalists. I'm making a statement." "About what?" Belle looked at Nate Brennan's service photo, at the man who'd saved her twice and asked for nothing. "About the things we choose not to see." The press conference assembled in 90 minutes. Belle's PR team scrambled, called in favors, got 5 journalists to Lockhart Industries headquarters by 10 a.m. They set up in the main conference room cameras, microphones, the same machinery Belle had used 100 times to control narratives. This time felt different. This time she hadn't prepared remarks. She walked to the podium in a simple gray suit. No script, no notes, just the weight of what she needed to say. The room quieted. Belle looked into the cameras and started talking. "Last month I was in a car accident. I nearly died." The journalists leaned forward. This was news Belle Lockhart didn't do vulnerable. "The person who saved my life wasn't a surgeon. He wasn't a paramedic. He wasn't someone with a prestigious title or a corner office." She paused, let them process. "His name is Nathaniel Brennan. He's a night shift security guard at St. Mercy Hospital. And I need to tell you who he really is." Across town, Nate was sitting in the hospital cafeteria with Emma helping her with fractions when his coworker Carlos rushed over with his phone. "Bro, you need to see this. Now." Nate looked up confused. Carlos thrust the phone at him. On screen, Belle Lockhart stood at a podium speaking to cameras. "Nathaniel Brennan is a decorated combat medic. He served multiple tours overseas, saved dozens of lives under fire, earned the Silver Cross for valor." Emma's eyes went huge. She grabbed Nate's arm. "Dad, that's you." The cafeteria's TV was tuned to local news. Other people were looking up now, turning to stare at Nate. Belle kept talking. "When I asked him to stay quiet about saving me, I didn't know. I didn't know who he was, what he'd sacrificed, what he'd given." Her voice cracked. The camera zoomed tighter on her face. "Nathaniel Brennan is the kind of person this world needs more of. And I was too blind to see it." She stepped back from the podium, looked directly into the lens. "Nate, if you're watching, I'm sorry." The feed cut to reporters shouting questions. Nate sat frozen. Emma clutching his arm, the cafeteria erupting into whispers and stares. His phone started ringing, unknown numbers, constant buzzing. Carlos was grinning like an idiot. "Dude, you're famous." Nate's stomach turned. This was the opposite of what he'd wanted, the opposite of the quiet life he'd built in the ruins of his old one. Emma tugged his sleeve, eyes shining. She said, "Sorry, that's good, right?" Nate didn't know how to answer. He gathered their things, took Emma's hand, walked out of the cafeteria while people stared and phones captured him from every angle. The hospital lobby had a television. Belle's press conference played on loop. His military photo filled the screen, younger, harder, a stranger wearing his face. He pushed through the exit doors into cold autumn air. His truck sat in the far corner of the lot. He aimed for it like a target, Emma jogging to keep up. "Dad, are you mad?" "No, sweetheart, just tired." They drove home in silence. Nate's phone wouldn't stop ringing. He turned it off. At their apartment building, a news van idled at the curb. Nate cursed under his breath, parked in the alley behind the building, hustled Emma through the back entrance. Inside, safe behind a locked door, Emma finally asked the question he'd been dreading. "Why didn't you tell me you were a hero?" Nate knelt down, hands on her shoulders, searching for words an 8-year-old could understand. Because heroes are just people who were in the right place at the right time. I did my job, that's all. But you saved all those people. You got medals. And a lot of good people didn't come home. Being a hero means something different to everyone, Em. To me it means being here for you. That's what matters. She studied his face with her 2 old eyes, then hugged him fierce and tight. Tyler's going to be so mad. Despite everything, Nate laughed. Leave it to his daughter to find the silver lining. The phone calls kept coming. Nate powered the phone back on long enough to see the notifications, interview requests, job offers, messages from people he hadn't spoken to in years. He deleted most without reading. But one message made him pause, from a number he didn't recognize. The advisor position is still open. Part-time. Flexible. $90,000 annually. We need you. CEO Belle Lockhart. Offering him a job. After exposing him to the world he'd been avoiding. Nate stared at the message for a long time. Thought about Emma's question about the backyard she wanted, about the medication that cost more every month. Thought about the life he could give her if he had resources. Thought about the price of stepping back into visibility. He typed a response. Need to think about it. Her reply came instantly. Take all the time you need, but please, let me try to make this right. Nate set the phone down, looked at Emma, safe and warm in their tiny apartment. Thought about the man he used to be and the man he'd become. Wondered if there was a version of himself that could exist between the two. 3 days later, he walked into the security office at St. Mercy and found Belle Lockhart waiting for him. She stood when he entered, hands clasped in front of her like a nervous petitioner. Out of place in her tailored suit among the scarred desks and flickering monitors. Nate, thank you for meeting me. He closed the door, stayed standing. You didn't have to do that. The press conference. Yes, I did. I owed you more than silence. You didn't owe me anything. Belle's expression cracked slightly. I owed you everything, and I tried to bury you because I was scared of looking weak. The honesty surprised him. Nate leaned against the desk, arms crossed. Why are you here? To apologize. Not on camera, not for the press. Just to you. She took a breath, steadying herself. I read your file. I know what you gave up, what you lost. And I know that what I did asking you to hide that was unforgivable. People make choices. You made yours. And I want to unmake them. The advisor position, I meant it. Part-time. Flexible hours. Training staff, developing protocols. Work that uses what you know. Work that pays enough for... She stopped. Nate waited. For whatever you need. For Emma. The mention of his daughter's name landed heavy. Belle must have seen it in his face because she rushed ahead. I'm not trying to buy you. I'm trying to offer something fair, something that acknowledges what you can do instead of asking you to hide it. Nate looked at her, really looked, saw past the CEO armor to the woman underneath, the one who'd begged for death and gotten sunrise instead, the one who was trying clumsily to make amends. Why didn't you tell anyone that you were a medic? That you were... She couldn't finish the word. Nate did it for her. A hero. Belle nodded. Nate's voice went quiet, carrying the weight of every loss he'd never processed. Heroes are the ones who don't come home. I'm just a guy who got lucky. The words hung between them. Belle's eyes glistened. That's not true. It's true enough. Silence stretched. Then Belle straightened, composure settling back over her features. The position. Will you take it? Nate thought about Emma, about the backyard and the medication and the future that always seemed just out of reach. Thought about the man he'd been and the father he'd become, about whether it was possible to be both. Emma needs stability. If this helps with that, if I can still be there for her, then yeah, I'll take it. Belle's relief was visible. Good, because we need you. She extended her hand. Nate shook it, her grip firm and warm. When she left, the security office felt smaller, emptier, like something had shifted in the foundations of his carefully constructed world. His phone buzzed. Message from Emma's school. Your daughter told her class about you. Tyler apologized. Thought you should know. Nate smiled despite himself. Maybe some good could come from exposure. Maybe being seen wasn't always a weakness. He looked at the jacket hanging on its hooked navy blue polyester St. Mercy security. Tomorrow he'd still wear it. Would still walk the halls and check the doors. But now there'd be something else too. A different kind of service. A different way to save lives. Outside the window, the sun was setting over the hospital parking lot, painting everything gold. Nate watched it sink below the horizon and thought about sunrise. About promises kept and debts that couldn't be measured. About the woman who'd asked for death and the second chance they'd both been given. The first training session happened on a Tuesday afternoon in a conference room that smelled like stale coffee and whiteboard markers. Nate stood at the front facing 20 hospital staff members, nurses, orderlies, administrative personnel who'd never touched a patient but might need to someday. He'd prepared slides on emergency protocols, triage basics, when to call for help and when to act. His hands felt wrong without a rifle or a medical kit exposed and useless gesturing at PowerPoint animations. Belle sat in the back row, laptop open but untouched, watching him navigate the presentation with the same careful attention she brought to board meetings. Nate tried to ignore her presence, focus on the faces in front of him. A young nurse raised her hand. What if we freeze in the moment, What if we can't remember any of this? Nate thought about sand and blood and the sound mortars made before impact. About the first time he'd held someone's life in his hands and felt it slip away anyway. You will freeze. Everyone does the first time. The trick is making the freeze last 3 seconds instead of 3 minutes. You breathe. You remember one thing, just one, and you do that thing until the next thing becomes clear. The nurse nodded, scribbling notes. Nate moved through the rest of the material, CPR refresher, recognizing stroke symptoms, controlling bleeding. Basic skills that could mean the difference between a patient making it to surgery or coding in the hallway. When the session ended, staff filtered out with handouts and questions Nate answered while packing his laptop. Belle approached, last heels clicking on linoleum. That was good. Clear. You're a natural teacher. Nate shrugged into his jacket. Not the security uniform anymore, but a blazer Belle's assistant had purchased for these sessions. It fit wrong across the shoulders. Just sharing what I know. It's more than that. You make people believe they can handle emergencies. That's a gift. He didn't know how to respond to praise that felt unearned, so he changed subjects. How's the foundation work going? Belle's expression shifted, something troubled crossing her features. We're expanding emergency services at 3 hospitals, funding paramedic training programs. The board approved the budget. That's good. It should be, but Richard Kane is making noise about wasteful spending, says charity work should be secondary to shareholder value. Nate had heard the name. Kane was the CFO who'd positioned himself as Belle's internal opposition, a corporate shark who viewed compassion as weakness. What are you going to do? Belle met his eyes, and Nate saw the same steel that had built an empire from ashes. Ignore him until I can't, then fight. She left before he could ask what that meant. The weeks folded into a rhythm. Nate worked 3 nights a week as security, spent 2 afternoons training staff, and reserved mornings and evenings for Emma. The extra income from the advisor position felt surreal. He opened a savings account, started putting away money for the backyard that had transformed from impossible dream to eventual reality. Emma's asthma medication became a regular expense instead of a crisis. They ate dinner together without him calculating the cost of every ingredient. But the nightmares intensified. Nate would wake gasping, the taste of copper in his mouth, Sarah's face dissolving into smoke. Emma had stopped trying to comfort him, just left a glass of water on the coffee table before bed, so he'd have something to focus on when the dreams released him. He'd drink it slowly, hands shaking, and wonder if surviving meant carrying ghosts forever. One afternoon, Belle invited him to tour the new community clinic the foundation was funding. The site occupied a former warehouse in a neighborhood where emergency rooms turned away uninsured patients and people died from treatable conditions. Construction crews swarmed the space, transforming concrete and rust into something that might save lives. Belle walked Nate through the plan's exam rooms, a small surgical suite, mental health services. She pointed to a corner where they'd install a veterans support office. We want to make sure former service members have somewhere to go. For health care, for counseling, for community. Nate studied the blueprint throat tight. This was what Sarah had needed after he deployed a support network resources, someone to help carry the weight. Maybe if she'd had access to services like this, she wouldn't have been alone on that highway, stressed and exhausted, driving Emma to daycare because there was nobody else. Belle watched him reading something in his silence. Did I overstep? No, it's good, really good. He meant it. But the goodness hurt, a reminder of all the infrastructure that hadn't existed when it mattered, built too late for the people who'd needed it most. They walked to a coffee shop 2 blocks from the construction site. Belle ordered something complicated with oat milk. Nate got black coffee. They sat at a window table watching the street people hustling past, lives intersecting and diverging, the ordinary chaos of a city. Belle broke the silence first. Tell me about Sarah. The request landed gentle but unexpected. Nate wrapped his hands around the coffee cup, using the heat to ground himself. What do you want to know? How you met. What she was like. Whatever you're willing to share. Nate breathed out slowly. Talking about Sarah felt like handling broken glass, necessary sometimes, but always dangerous. We met at a party, college. I was pre-med, thought I'd be a doctor. She was studying social work. We argued about healthcare policy for 3 hours, then I asked for her number. Belle smiled slightly. Sounds like her kind of introduction. She made me better, smarter, more aware of the world outside my own head. When I enlisted, instead of finishing school, she supported it. Said some people need to serve before they can heal. He paused, the memory sharpening. Emma was born during my second deployment. I missed it. Saw her for the first time over video chat when she was 6 hours old. Sarah held the phone up to the camera, and Emma was this tiny screaming thing, and I cried in a supply tent halfway around the world. Belle's expression softened. You loved her very much. I loved them both. But I wasn't there. I was always somewhere else, saving strangers, while my family learned to live without me. You were serving. I was hiding. From the hard work of being present. From the vulnerability of civilian life. Sarah knew it. She never said it outright, but I could hear it in her voice during phone calls. The loneliness. The exhaustion. Nate's hands tightened on the cup. When she died, I was working triage after an attack. Hadn't slept in 30 hours. Was so deep in the work I didn't even check my phone. She'd tried to call me 3 times. Left messages I didn't hear until after. Nate. She said Emma had a fever. That she was scared about driving alone. That she just needed to hear my voice. The words came out flat, drained of emotion through repetition. If I'd answered, maybe she would have waited. Called someone else. Not been on that highway at that exact moment when the drunk driver crossed the median. Belle reached across the table, covered his hand with hers. You can't carry that. It wasn't your fault. I carry it anyway. They sat in silence while the coffee went cold and the city moved past the window, indifferent to grief. Finally Belle spoke, voice careful. My father died at his desk. Heart attack. 62 years old. I was 16, home from school, found him slumped over quarterly reports he'd been reviewing. Nate looked up, surprised by the confession. I tried CPR. Didn't know what I was doing. Broke 3 of his ribs and he died anyway. The paramedic said it wouldn't have mattered, massive coronary dead before he hit the floor. But I spent years wondering if I'd done it wrong, if better technique might have bought him minutes. Her grip on his hand tightened. We build walls to survive the wondering. You built yours out of service and distance. I built mine out of control and success, but walls keep you safe and trapped in equal measure. Nate turned his hand over, laced his fingers through hers. Yeah, they do. Outside, clouds broke apart, letting through pale November sunlight that turned the street golden. Neither of them moved to leave. That evening, Emma came home from school with a project assignment interview, someone who'd made a difference in the community. She sat at the kitchen table, construction paper and markers spread out, looking at Nate with expectation. "Can I interview you, Dad?" Nate paused mid-stir over a pot of spaghetti sauce. "What about Miss Martinez, your teacher?" "She's been at the school for 20 years. Emma shook her head. "Everyone's interviewing teachers. I want to interview you. About saving people." The weight of her gaze made Nate's chest constrict. He turned off the stove, sat across from her. "I'm not sure I'm the best subject." "Why not? You saved that lady, and the old man at the fancy party, and all those soldiers. Those were just what? Just your job. Tyler's dad is an accountant, and that's just his job. But Tyler interviewed him anyway." Nate couldn't argue with 8-year-old logic. He nodded. "Okay. What do you want to know?" Emma picked up a purple marker poised over blank paper. "What made you want to help people?" The question cut deeper than she knew. Nate thought about the real answer, that he'd joined the army to escape, to find purpose, to prove something to himself. That helping people had been incidental to the larger need for structure and meaning. But Emma didn't need that truth. "I wanted to make sure that when people were scared or hurting, they wouldn't be alone." Emma wrote carefully, tongue poking out in concentration. "What's the hardest part? Accepting that you can't save everyone. That sometimes your best isn't enough." She looked up from her paper markers, forgotten. "But you try anyway." "Yeah, you try anyway." Emma smiled, bright and uncomplicated, the kind of smile that made Nate believe in goodness despite everything. "That's what makes you a hero, Dad. Not the medals. The trying." Nate's throat tightened. He reached across the table, ruffled her hair. "When did you get so wise?" "I'm 8. I've been around." They laughed, and for a moment the apartment felt less like a holding pattern and more like home. The call came 3 weeks later while Nate was running a training scenario with ER staff. Belle's number flashed on his phone. He stepped into the hallway to answer. "Nate, I need you at the Foundation office. Now, if possible." Her voice carried tension wound tight. "What's wrong?" "Just please, I'll explain when you get here." He drove across town, parked in the visitor lot of Lockhart Industries, took the elevator to the Foundation's floor. Belle's assistant, Grant, met him, face drawn. "She's in her office. Conference call just ended. It's not good." Nate knocked, entered without waiting. Belle stood at her window, back to the door, shoulders rigid. "The board voted. They're cutting Foundation funding by 80%, effective immediately." The words landed like artillery. They can. Richard Kane led the vote, said charity work was bleeding company resources, that shareholders deserve returns, not feel-good initiatives. Belle turned. Her eyes were dry but haunted. "He gave me an ultimatum. Resign as CEO and let him restructure, or watch the Foundation die." Nate moved closer, giving her space but making his presence solid. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know. Everything I built, the company, the Foundation, it's all on the line. If I fight Kane and lose, both collapse. If I concede, the Foundation survives, but the company becomes something my father would hate." She pressed her palms to the glass, staring down at the city. "He used to say success without honor is just noise. I built an empire, and I'm realizing it might all be noise." Nate stood beside her, close enough their reflections merged in the window. "What do you want? Not what the board wants. Not what Kane expects. What does Belle Lockhart actually want?" She was quiet for a long time. Then her voice came small and certain. "I want the clinic to open. I want veterans to have support. I want people like you to be valued for what you give, not dismissed because you don't fit corporate metrics. Then fight for that. I'll lose the company. Maybe, but you'll keep the part that matters." Belle looked at him, searching his face for something, permission maybe, or confirmation that sacrifice could be worth it. "My father died building this company. If I let it go—" "Your father died at his desk reviewing quarterly reports. You told me that. Is that what he would have wanted for you?" The question hung between them. Belle's expression cracked, tears finally breaking through. "No, he would have wanted me to live." Nate took her hand the same way she'd taken his in the coffee shop. "Then live. Fight for what you believe in. Let the rest fall where it falls." She gripped his fingers tight, anchor in storm. I'm scared. Good. Means it matters. They stood together while the sun set over the city, and Belle made a decision that would cost her everything she'd built and give her back everything she'd lost. The emergency board meeting convened the next morning. Belle walked into the conference room in a simple gray suit, no armor, no performance. Just resolve. Richard Kane sat at the head of the table surrounded by allies. He smiled when she entered. Belle, glad you could join us. Have you considered our proposal? She took her seat, folded her hands on the polished wood. I have, and I'm resigning as CEO of Lockhart Industries. Satisfaction flickered across Kane's features. He leaned back, already tasting victory. A wise choice. We'll begin transition. But I'm transferring 30% of my personal equity, approximately $500 million, into the Lockhart Foundation endowment, effective immediately. The room went silent. Kane's smile died. You can't. I can, and I am. The foundation will operate independently. No board oversight. No shareholder approval required. Free to pursue its mission without corporate interference. Kane's face reddened. You're destroying shareholder value. I'll sue. Sue away. My equity is mine to allocate. Check with legal. Belle stood gathering her things. The company is yours, Richard. Build it however you like, but you'll never have what actually matters. She walked out before he could respond, leaving behind 15 years of work and walking towards something that felt like freedom. Grant found her in the parking garage, leaning against her car, shaking. Miss Lockhart, the press is already calling. They want statements. Kane's team is spinning this as instability. Let them spin. I'm done playing that game. She drove to the construction site, walked into the half-finished clinic, and called Nate. It's done. I'm out. The foundation has funding. We can finish this. His voice came steady and sure. Good. When do we start? Time moved differently after that. Belle threw herself into the clinic build-out, working alongside contractors, reviewing medical supply orders, interviewing staff. She donated her penthouse, moved into a modest apartment near the construction site. Stopped wearing designer suits, started showing up in jeans and work boots, hair pulled back, hands occasionally dirty. Nate watched the transformation with quiet amazement. This version of Belle, stripped of corporate armor, focused on tangible impact, reminded him of the woman who'd gripped his hand in the ER and begged for mercy. Real, vulnerable, fully human. They worked side by side through winter. Nate handled medical protocols, staff training, veteran outreach. Belle managed logistics, funding, community partnerships. Emma spent afternoons at the clinic after school doing homework in what would become the waiting room, occasionally helping sort donated supplies. One evening in early spring, Belle found Emma in the corner office, Nate's office, though he barely used it, applying a bandage to another kid's scraped knee with serious concentration. There, all better. The kid, maybe 6 years old, smiled and ran off. Belle leaned against the doorframe. You're a natural caretaker. Emma looked up, her father's hazel eyes bright with purpose. Dad says helping people is our family business. Belle's chest tightened. She crossed the room, knelt beside Emma. Your dad's right, and you're very good at it. She pulled a small box from her pocket, opened it to reveal a silver bracelet. The engraving read, Be brave, little healer. I got this for you. Thought you might like it. Emma's face lit up. She held out her wrist, let Belle fasten the clasp. It's beautiful. Thank you. Then Emma did something Belle didn't expect, threw her arms around Belle's neck in a fierce hug. Belle froze for a heartbeat, then wrapped her arms around the small body, holding on like Emma might disappear. When they pulled apart, Emma studied Belle's face with disconcerting intensity. Are you the lady from TV, the one Dad saved? Yes. Good. He needed someone to save. He gets sad sometimes when he's not helping people. The observation landed with devastating accuracy. Belle blinked back tears. Your dad is pretty amazing. I know, but he forgets sometimes. You should remind him. Belle laughed, watery but genuine. I'll do my best. That night, Nate found an envelope under his office door. Inside, a handwritten letter on foundation stationery. Nate, you saved me twice. Once from death, once from myself. I don't know how to repay that. Maybe I never can, but I'm trying to be better because of you. Thank you for seeing me when I couldn't see myself. Thank you for believing I deserved sunrise. I'm staying. For this work. For what we're building. For you and Emma and everyone who needs what we're creating here. Thank you for not letting me make it fast. Nate folded the letter, carefully tucked it into his pocket, walked to the window overlooking the clinic's main floor. Below, Belle worked with contractors, pointing at blueprints, laughing at something someone said. She looked lighter, freer, like she'd shed weight she'd carried so long she'd forgotten it wasn't part of her. He thought about walls and bridges, about the distance between surviving and living, about how sometimes the people you save end up saving you back. His phone buzzed. Emma texting from Linda's. Dad, I finished my interview project. Got an A. Teacher said your story made her cry. Love you. Nate smiled, typed back. Love you too, sweetheart. Proud of you. See you tomorrow. Tomorrow. The word felt less like a threat now, more like a promise. The grand opening happened on a June morning so clear it hurt to look at the sky. The Brennan Center for Community Healing named over Nate's protests, but Belle had insisted rose 3 stories, glass and steel and purpose. Hundreds gathered on the lawn, veterans in dress uniforms, families from the neighborhood, hospital staff, media with cameras and questions. Belle stood at the podium in simple gray, no corporate polish, just conviction. A year ago I almost died. The man who saved me taught me that healing isn't just for the wounded, it's for everyone who still cares enough to treat them. She paused, found Nate in the crowd. Nathaniel Brennan, please come up here. Nate shook his head, but Emma pushed him forward. The crowd parted. He climbed the steps, uncomfortable with visibility but unable to refuse. Belle handed him the microphone. He stared at it like it might explode. I'm not good with speeches, better with bandages. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Nate's shoulders relaxed slightly. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that healing doesn't happen in isolation. We all carry pain, scars, memories we'd rather forget. The question isn't whether we're wounded, it's what we do with those wounds. He looked at Emma in the front row, silver bracelet catching sunlight. Do we build walls to hide behind, or do we build bridges to reach each other? His voice grew stronger, carrying across the gathered crowd. I chose bridges. I hope you will too. Applause started slow, built into something powerful. Belle stepped forward with a wooden box, opened it to reveal a medal, custom-made, simple, beautiful. The engraving read, Don't make it fast. Stay. Nate's breath caught. Belle's hands trembled as she pinned it to his chest. You told me I'd see sunrise. I've seen 1,000 since that night, every single one because of you. Her voice broke, but she pushed through. Don't leave Nate. Don't fade into the background. The world needs people like you. She paused, meeting his eyes. I need people like you. Nate looked at her, really looked. Saw past the CEO she'd been to the person she'd become. Someone who'd chosen compassion over control, who'd sacrificed empire for impact, who'd learned that strength wasn't about walls but about what you built in the spaces between them. His voice came soft but certain. Some pain's worth feeling. Belle smiled through tears. Yeah, it really is. The crowd erupted. Emma ran onto the stage, threw herself at Nate. He caught her, held her close. Belle's hand found his shoulder, steadying herself, or him, or both. Then Emma pulled out a folded piece of paper, carefully preserved construction paper with crayon drawings. She held it up for the crowd. The image showed a man kneeling beside a woman, a jacket draped over her, a bright glowing heart between them. Written at the bottom in careful letters, Dad giving jacket to lady. Heart shining. The crowd melted. Cameras flashed. But Nate only saw 2 faces, his daughter beaming with uncomplicated pride, and Belle looking at him like he'd given her something more valuable than life. Later, when the ceremony ended and the crowd dispersed, The three of them stood together on the clinic steps. Emma between them, small hands gripping theirs, the silver bracelet catching light. "Can we get pancakes now?" Nate and Belle laughed real laughter, the kind that comes from relief and joy and the strange alchemy of found family. "Yeah, sweetheart, pancakes sound perfect." They walked toward Nate's truck, the building rising behind them, sunlight painting everything gold. Emma chattered about school and friends and the backyard Nate had promised was coming soon. Belle listened, asking questions integrated into their orbit like she'd always belonged there. At the truck, Belle paused. "I'm staying. With the foundation. With this work. I want you to know that." Nate met her eyes, saw the certainty there. "Good. We need you here." Emma tugged both their hands. "Can Miss Belle come for pancakes too?" Belle looked at Nate, question in her expression. He nodded. "Yeah, she can." They piled into the truck, Emma in the middle, Nate driving, Belle riding shotgun. The radio played something soft and forgettable. Nobody talked. Didn't need to. Nate caught Belle's reflection in the rearview mirror, watched her trace the edge of Emma's bracelet with gentle fingers. Thought about the night she'd begged for death and he'd promised sunrise. About all the sunrises since. About the ones still coming. Some people enter your life like storms, he thought. Others like sunrise. He'd figured out which one she was. The diner smelled like coffee and maple syrup. They slid into a booth, Emma against the window, Nate and Belle across from her. Ordered too much food. Watched Emma drown her pancakes in syrup while Belle told stories about the clinic's opening day mishaps, and Nate added quiet commentary that made them both laugh. Outside, the city moved past the windows. People hurrying to wherever people hurry. Lives intersecting and diverging. The ordinary chaos that looked different when you stopped trying to control it. Emma fell asleep on the drive home, sticky with syrup content. Belle helped Nate carry her upstairs, waited while he tucked her into bed and kissed her forehead. In the hallway, standing close in the dim light, Belle spoke quietly. "Thank you. For pancakes. For letting me be part of this. You are part of this. Have been since the night you asked me to make it fast." Belle's hand found his squeezed gently. "I'm glad you didn't." "Me too." She left before the moment could become something heavier. Nate watched her car pull away, then sat on the couch in the dark. The metal rested on the coffee table. "Don't make it fast. Stay." He picked it up, felt the weight of it. Thought about staying, about building instead of hiding, about what came next. His phone glowed with a message from Belle. "Same time next week. Pancakes and clinic planning," Nate typed back. "Yeah, sounds good." He set the phone down, looked at Emma's door slightly ajar so he could hear if she needed him. Thought about Sarah, about the ways grief had shaped him into someone who could help others because he knew what it meant to need help and not get it. Thought about walls and bridges and the fact that sometimes the strongest thing you could do was ask someone to stay. The apartment was quiet, peaceful. Nate closed his eyes, and for the first time in 5 years, when sleep came, there were no nightmares. Just the steady rhythm of Emma's breathing from the other room, just the memory of Belle's smile, just the promise of sunrise and pancakes and work that mattered. Just enough. More than enough. Everything.